And now to pay scales. We're looking at the top executives at listed South African companies have been earning around 5.2 million rand annually. That's according to the PWC Trends report published today. But that's before COVID-19 hit. They're expecting an increase of just over 5% in executive packages for the next financial year. But how possible is this? Considering the current economic climate, PWC Associate Director Leila Ebrahimi joins me now to unpack this further. Good evening, Leila. We've long known about the incredible pay scales of those executives, especially of JSE-listed organizations. But I suppose in the context of COVID-19, what it has really done is put the context to the incredible inequality that this country is in, and the conversation around the sacrifices that those who are at the top also need to start making.
Yes, evening, and thanks for having me. Indeed, we definitely are very aware, particularly in South Africa, about the income disparity, and that's a large focus in our report this year. So we've done an extensive article looking at, what are the pay ratios and what should they look like. As many of your viewers will be aware, there's mandatory disclosure which is imminent within South Africa, so it hasn't yet been gazetted, but there are proposals in place to disclose the pay gap between the highest paid and the lowest paid within any organization within the remuneration report. So with this in mind, we actually went and we had a look at what would an appropriate ratio be, first focusing on fixed pay, because obviously variable pay comes with its own complications, and how much is too much, essentially.
Sure. And why is it important for especially boards and remuneration committees to be able to tackle this issue?
Why is it important?
Yeah.
Well, naturally, there's been a lot of research done regarding the impact of income disparity. And I think within South Africa, there's two ways to look at this. There's income disparity within an organization, and then there's obviously the major disparities we have because of the level of unemployment. Interestingly, with COVID, what's really come to the fore with the level of retrenchment and pay cuts and so on is the fact that executive pay cannot be looked at in isolation. Many of you will be familiar with King 4, which says that executive pay should be looked at in the context of overall employee remuneration. And I think at times like this, we're really starting to understand what exactly it is that means. So really, remuneration committees and boards need to think, with a wider context, looking at fairness and saying, what are all of the considerations we need to take into account when deciding if this is appropriate?
Does it matter then when some of the entities we're talking about are subsidiaries of multinational organizations, and therefore their pay is not really benchmarked against South Africa, but it's really against what their counterparts in the rest of the world could well be earning?
It's a really good question, and it's one of the most difficult things to solve. And you'll see within our report where we actually do the analysis, we actually pull out the top 10 JSE-listed companies because so many of those have CEOs who are actually receiving pay which is denominated in a currency other than rand, and that comes with its own complications. Pay in South Africa really isn't comparable to pay elsewhere. The US is kind of on a scale of its own. In our report, we do look at the FTSE 100 and the FTSE 250. And interestingly, if you look at the median CEO pay on the FTSE 250, use a kind of average exchange rate, it comes to more or less double the median CEO pay for the JSE, which kind of gives you an indication of where South Africa is, relatively speaking.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, Leila, if we are to compare the pay of executives in South Africa, would they effectively be ranking low on the lower end of the scale compared to their global colleagues?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm talking about fixed pay at the moment, but you'll see we've included research from our colleagues in the UK. So the FTSE 250, the median pay there translated to somewhere between 10 and 11 million rand, as I mentioned, using an average exchange rate, whereas the median CEO pay for the JSE, as you mentioned, was about 5.2 million. So it's roughly double. And that is consistent with what we've observed in the market. Naturally, for JSE-listed companies who have CEOs who are receiving pay that isn't denominated in rand, the effect is very far removed, and that's why we actually took them out of our research, or took them out of the analysis at some point, to see what the effect was on the analysis.
Let's talk about some of the incentives and bonuses, because fixed pay, like you're saying, is one issue. Are they are there moral questions that can legitimately be raised around the kind of bonuses that CEOs are receiving? Because we know that their fixed income is but just a fraction of what the overall benefit they may be receiving.
Absolutely. I think that none of us are, under any pretenses regarding a total reward package, and we know that an executive would expect 3 components within their pay. So fixed pay, as you quite rightly say, is one component, but obviously the bonus and the long-term incentive are hinged off of that. So are there moral questions to be asked? Certainly there are. Remuneration committees need to ask themselves, is the bonus appropriate in terms of the context? What is the context? Things like, whether there have been any retrenchments, have there been any pay cuts, what is happening with all your employees. And this is where we get to, it's not just your shareholders that you need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about a wide range of stakeholders and, how the way that you do business impacts on all of those stakeholders. So certainly now more than ever, it's always an important question. It always needs to be asked. King 4 demands it to be asked, but now more than ever, I think it's coming to the forefront.
Leila, before I let you go, let's talk about the gender pay parity and the kind of pay that we're seeing. Of course, the JSE has very few CEOs for the listed companies that are female. But for those that are female-run, are we seeing that the salary scales are comparable with their male counterparts?
Unfortunately, I would love to agree with you, but it's not the case. And this is where the question comes in, do we need regulation? And I know it's a prickly topic. Obviously, the UK has regulation in this regard, and certainly calls within South Africa have been made for that type of disclosure regulation. The regulation I referred to earlier is highest paid, lowest paid, doesn't have anything to do with gender. And we're seeing gaps of 25% at the small cap, up to about 45% within the large cap. If you break it down by industry, financial services is kind of okay at 7%. No gap is okay, but at 7% it's acceptable. But it goes up to quite substantial gaps within other industries, which is up to 60% in some instances, which obviously is quite shocking.
Sure. Which industries are those, Leila? I mean, I can't think about a 60% pay difference, and this is allowed to actually happen because chances are the male CEO who this woman has likely taken over from did not receive the same salary that she is.
Yeah, and I think an important caveat, which I must mention there, is our primary problem here is representation. So you mentioned there are very few women CEOs. So the good news is we had 12 women appointed as CEOs since May 2019, since we last did the research. So there is movement. But unfortunately, when you do analyses, and you have such a small group of individuals that you're looking at, it's not easy to ascertain trends, and that's why we see these stark variances. Real estate is actually the worst industry to answer your question, but also we don't see many female executives there. So that kind of speaks to itself. And the one percentage I gave you was across all the executive directors, and the other one was across CEOs. But our report does set out the detail. But in conclusion, shocking, and I think higher than other countries. No country has managed to close the gender pay gap. But South Africa is definitely not doing great.